On June the 5th, the wheels of the huge machine began turning. Allied planes attacked northern and western France to prevent the German rearguard from reaching Normandy. Allied bombers were unparticular about their targets. They struck Lower Normandy for 3 full days, claiming almost 4,000 German and civilian lives. The bombing raids led to heated discussions between Eisenhower and Churchill. The latter was concerned about the weight of hatred they would cause amongst the French. To the surprise of the Allies, the French resistance replied, "This is war. We must accept people will die." On June the 3rd in Algiers, General de Gaulle had transformed the French Committee of National Liberation into the provisional government of the French Republic. Until then, he had been kept silent. The Allies had concealed everything from the French. But as the liberation of France drew nearer, the British and Americans needed de Gaulle to ensure the full cooperation of the people and the French resistance. On June the 4th, after being summoned by Churchill, de Gaulle left for Britain, intent on speaking his mind. He refused to let the Allies lay down the law. But despite the fact they refused to entrust him with full power, the sensitive general agreed to back Overlord. On June the 5th, at sea, diversion tactics continued to be deployed. Dozens of small ships headed north of Le Havre. Their funnels billowed out steam, both as a smokescreen and to have the Germans believe a huge fleet was crossing the channel towards a position far north of the targeted Normandy beaches. General Eisenhower had always believed that a leader's place is alongside his men before and during battle. Late in the afternoon of June the 5th, at Greenham Common Airfield, a few hours before they took off, he visited the US 101st Airborne Division. They would be amongst the first to reach French soil. Ike's smiling face masked his underlying tension. All the more reason for paratroopers to put on a brave face and reassure their leader. That evening, Eisenhower stayed till the end, till the last plane had taken off. A little farther away, not having their leader there to cheer them on in person, the reconnaissance paratroopers came up with their own way to put on a brave face. Whether real Redskins or just the white man's myth of the Native American warrior, their scarlet war paint at least helped these 20-something Iroquois to get ready for action. Those without war paint simply blackened their faces with charcoal so as to be less visible. As well as their weapons and parachutes, these men would be jumping with radio transmitters to signal marked zones where the gliders could drop the majority of troopers. Three men were needed to help one paratrooper on board who had a 50% chance of survival and who knew it. That same night, Ike wrote a letter in case the landing should end in disaster, proof of how the Allies were certain of nothing. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. But for weeks, the Allies had been perfecting a well-established plan. During the night of June the 5th, German coastal defenses were to be wiped out by bombs. Naval artillery would start firing at dawn from 45 miles offshore. The British and Canadians would take the right flank of the invasion. They were assigned 3 beaches: Sword, Juno, and Gold, located between Ouistreham and Arromanches. The Americans would take the left flank, with Omaha and Utah beaches. The British would need to capture Caen as quickly as possible. The city was an important communication hub through which the Germans could bring in reinforcements. It also opened onto flat land, which would allow Allied armored divisions to spread out and planes to land at temporary airfields. The Americans would have to move up to Cherbourg, which they planned to capture within a week, so that hundreds of thousands of other men could land with all their material needed for the next stage of the offensive. On June the 6th from 3:15 in the morning, Allied planes started bombing German positions across every sector of the landings. At dawn, naval artillery took over in order to smash the Atlantic Wall. Omaha Beach near the cotton town was the first objective. The Americans would have to quickly establish a beachhead, then join up with their colleagues at Utah before heading towards Cherbourg together. After arriving too soon or too late, many of the aerial bombardments missed their targets. Naval artillery didn't fare much better. The early hour of the landings, determined by the tide, didn't give it enough time to successfully carry out its pulverization of the Atlantic Wall. The main part of the attack fell to the experienced GIs of the Big Red One. But attached to them was the 116th Battalion, made up of young men who had never been in the line of fire. To keep out of the range of enemy fire, the landing craft were released onto a rough sea too far from the coast. The men were crammed in like pack animals. Robert Capper, the only photographer present that day, said, "When the noise of the first shell hit our ears, we hit the deck and lay in our vomit without watching the coast approach." Barely on the beach, the men were greeted by an almost intact German defense. It was like a turkey shoot. The wind brought in the tide earlier than forecast. The following waves of attack floundered on Rommel's sea defenses, forcing the men to leave their craft in deep water. Unable to advance, they grouped together in the center of the beach, reduced to sending the same terrifyingly precise message, nailed to the spot by enemy artillery, more like crucified, as shown by these few remaining photos by Kappa. The rest were accidentally destroyed. Strong currents swept the landing craft off course. Men drowned as the weight of their equipment dragged them down. The sea turned red, and Omaha Beach would later be referred to as Bloody Omaha. The US command considered calling off the offensive, a desperate measure which would mean abandoning those who had already landed to their fate. There were already hundreds of dead and wounded. Their sacrifice would have been in vain. Stopping the operation would open a huge breach in the Allied front, just as the gigantic war machine was moving up to full throttle. The morning of June the 6th, daybreak revealed an armada of 7,000 vessels approaching the Normandy coasts. As always, Ike wasn't far away. At 9:45 a.m., he spoke to the world via the BBC.
I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
Across a 45-mile front, there was practically one boat every 250 meters with air cover from 11,000 planes. All were painted with white stripes so that Allied artillery wouldn't mistakenly fire at them. Fortunately, not every sector along the coast resembled Omaha, especially since the Germans had been taken in by Allied disinformation and still believed the main attack would come in the Calais region, and they were having trouble regrouping. And the unbreakable Atlantic Wall began to crumble, as did German anti-aircraft defenses, which became overrun. Allied aviation imperviously flew 10,000 sorties on that day. As the B-26s were releasing their last bombs inland, the fighter planes entered into action. Not only were coastal defenses targeted, but airfields too, in order to keep what remained of enemy planes on the ground. Communication hubs, roads, bridges, railways were all systematically destroyed. The British 3rd Infantry Division was heading for Sword. Its mission? To neutralize the defenses at Ouistreham and take Caen the same day. This unit, the Scotsmen of the 45th Commando of the Royal Marines, filmed by their compatriot Sergeant Ian Grant, were to land at Ouistreham. He wrote, "This was the real thing. I filmed the gigantic fleet as best I could, as I was more or less at sea level." We'd been given good rations and even seasickness pills. But with the diesel fumes, most men, even the strongest amongst us, got sick. The sky was black with planes. Some of them had been told to fly at low altitude, so we could be told over the loudspeaker the specific types and tell them apart from enemy planes. We told the men to ignore the cameras as much as possible. They were natural actors, deep in their thoughts, living their own experiences. I wasn't afraid, because there was no fear on their faces. Just the desire to get out of that bloody boat that was making them seasick. The closer we got to the beach, the more deafening the noise became. In the rush, a ramp broke. Everyone converged on the remaining gangplank. You just had to get off as best you could with the weight of your backpack pulling you down. Grant and the others were spared the first assault. For them, the hard part was about to begin, joining up with the paratroopers who had been dropped behind enemy lines. Another cameraman was already on Sword Beach. The youngest among them, Sergeant O'Neill, had arrived 45 minutes before Grant. It was he who filmed the last moments of the battle. In the thick of that grey smoke, everything seemed unreal. It wasn't a battle that you could imagine or see in a movie. The exits from the beach were congested. It was nigh on impossible to get off. I followed an infantry platoon which was trying to get out of there. At this point, the jolting camera indicates that O'Neill has been shot. He had just time to film a last few sequences before being repatriated for medical care. Farewell, Sergeant O'Neill, and well done to all your comrades who captured Sword on that day at a cost of 600 dead and wounded, all lost in the mass of unknowns, most of whom were barely 20 years old. Germans who had been taken prisoner were rounded up on the beaches. A few miles away from Sword, Juno Beach in the Canadian sector. Their mission, to take Carpiquet, Caen Airport. What were these young soldiers thinking after making the 5,000-mile journey to land at Bernières, a small, unknown seaside resort in Normandy? This is footage of the first wave of attack, the only one to be filmed during the landings, but by an automatic camera fixed to the bulwark. And yet, even the cold eye of a mechanical camera can't fail to capture a simple human gesture. Soon, the very first French house would be liberated in Normandy. It would cost the lives of 100 men, which Allied cameramen had been asked not to film. It was better to focus on the first German prisoners and the anger that one proud Frenchman showed towards them. The German surrender did nothing to mask the difficulties met by the men on Juno Beach, where a rough sea was causing problems for the landing of the second assault wave. A total of 300 young Canadians lost their lives. The sacrifice wasn't in vain. With the beachhead established, their surviving colleagues began their advance inland towards Caen. And already the first reward, in the shape of these young French women, delighted at seeing their country liberated by these men, many of whom spoke French, albeit with a funny accent. And yet, at Allied headquarters in Portsmouth, and despite British Admiral Ramsay smiling with pride at the part played by his fleet, General Eisenhower still seemed anxious. Since dawn, he had been receiving message after message, some alarming, like those from Omaha, some encouraging, like those from Utah, or in the British sector. From the look on Ike's face, you can tell the battle hasn't yet been won. Because 6 hours after landing at Omaha, the boys were still stuck at the foot of the cliff. The Americans always do the best for their men, whatever extra backup is required. Even the first assault waves were accompanied by an experienced medical corps ready to take immediate care of the wounded, including the enemy. Never had first aid been so needed as at bloody Omaha, where the dead lay alongside a handful of prisoners. 3,000 Americans lost their lives on the most deadly of the 5 beaches used for the landings. And yet, late in the day, with the sun out and after the first waves had managed to establish beachheads and advance inland, more troops began to arrive at Omaha. At last, it was possible to say that the landings had been a success. Now it was on to the next battle, for Normandy and for France.